in the Gospel of St. John. The Gospel of St. John. We are up to chapter 19, John 19. Ooh, it's getting dark. If I am correct, we're right at the beginning of chapter 19, are we not, Sandy?
I think you were in the middle of it, but I'm not. Well, Gene's saying no. I don't know. I'm not sure about that.
John 19:1.
All right.
Then Pilate, therefore, took Jesus and scourged him. And the soldiers wove a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. And they began to come up to him and say, "Hail, King of the Jews," and give to him blows in the face. And Pilate came out again and said to him, "Behold, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no guilt in him." Jesus therefore came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said to him, "Behold the man." In Latin, he would have said ecce homo, of course. When therefore the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, saying, "Crucify, crucify." And Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." The Jews, meaning the Judean religious establishment, the Sanhedrin and those they controlled, answered him, "We have a law, and by that law he ought to die, because he made himself out to be the Son of God. By the Torah he should die by making himself out to be the Son of God, unless, of course, that is who he was and who he is." When Pilate therefore heard this statement, he was the more afraid, and he entered into the praetorium and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. Pilate therefore said to him, "You do not speak to me. Do you not know that I have authority to release you, and I have authority to crucify you?" And Jesus answered, "You have no authority over me unless it had been given to you from above. For this reason, he who delivered me up to you has the greater sin." As a result of this, Pilate made efforts to release him. But the Jews cried out, saying, "If you release the man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself out to be king opposes Caesar." And when Pilate therefore heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at the place called of the pavement, which in Hebrew is called Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover. It was about the 6th hour, meaning it would have been 6 hours since dawn, 12 noon, thereabout. It was not precisely then. They therefore cried out, "Away with him, crucify him." And Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" And the chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." Now again, the chief priest would have been a Sadducee, a Roman collaborator, not to the degree of the Herodians, but a Roman collaborator. They were willing to collaborate very much with Rome. We have to understand this political background to understand the mentality of Pilate. Josephus writes about Pilate and his personality and his demeanor. And the description of him given by Josephus is very much in harmony with the kind of character the New Testament presents us with, very much so. He was a complete political animal, and he was thinking of his own interests in a system of Roman government where Rome was no longer a republic, but now an empire, an imperial dictatorship. Let's begin, however, during the period of the Maccabees, 160 years earlier. There were Jewish collaborators with the Seleucids, with Antiochus Epiphanes. They were Jewish collaborators, led by Menelaus, a corrupt high priest. These people were of Sadduceic descent. Sadduceic descent from the sons of Zadok. Okay. You had a situation where there was a high priest who made himself a king wrongly during the Hasmonean period. A king had to be a descendant of David. A priest had to be a descendant of Aaron. The two could not be the same. That's important. A priest was a priest. A king was a king. One from the tribe of Judah, the other from the tribe of Levi. But in the Hasmonean period, following the victory of the Maccabees, things began to change. There was a big political threat from the Persians, at that time called Parthians. Parthians. There was, in fact, a Jewish community that remained in Persia all the way back from the time of the Persian and Babylonian captivity. Not all the Jews came back. Some of them came for the day of Pentecost, for the Feast of Weeks. You see, there were Jews from Parthia. But Parthia was a major strategic threat. Persia was a threat to the West, to the Roman Empire. Although they were defeated by Alexander the Great, and they were no longer the superpower Greece was, they still remained a formidable regional power. A formidable regional power. Rome conquered most of the known world. Most of the known world, but there were regions they didn't conquer or were not interested in conquering. On the south, they were not interested in going too far into the Sahara. They did go to Mauritania, but not beyond that. It was desert to them. Much of it uncrossable, too arid, no water, etc. Going further to the east, they had a similar view of the Arabian Peninsula. They did not bother to conquer Arabia. They did not bother to go down to Yemen. They could have conquered the Arabian Peninsula, but they had no interest in what is today Saudi Arabia or Yemen. They didn't go that far. It was desert. It was worthless to them. Now, deserts then were seen as natural barriers. They're just not worth going any further. This began with Alexander the Great when he pushed east and conquered the Persians. He reached the desert of Baluchistan. That was the furthest Greek civilization came. There was some interconnection between Buddhism and the pagan Greeks in Afghanistan. There were actually statues of Buddha dressed up in Greek shrouds, Greek garments, that survived, but the Taliban blew them up. They were World Heritage Sites, and the UN asked them not to do it, but the Taliban blew them up in the 1990s. So the deserts. Alexander the Great has the story when he had water in his helmet and his men didn't have anything to drink, but they brought it to him. And if his men couldn't drink, he wouldn't either. And he poured the water out. It was just, don't go any further. It's not worth it. That was on the east. That was on the south. The West, they went all the way to what is known as the Pillars of Hercules. The Pillars of Hercules. The Pillars of Hercules was the Rock of Gibraltar and a similar cliff, smaller but big, in a place today called Ceuta, a Spanish colony in North Africa opposite Gibraltar, 8 miles away. The Straits of Gibraltar were the gates to the Atlantic Ocean from the Mediterranean world. They were the Pillars of Hercules. The Atlantic Ocean, you didn't go any further than that. Okay. Going to the north, they conquered most of England, but the Romans did not conquer Celtic Britain. They did not conquer Cornwall in the southwest of England. That remained Celtic. They bought German settlers from England and Saxony, who became the Anglo-Saxons, but those were not the original people. The original people were the Britons, and then there were Celts. In Scotland, there were the Picts and Scots. Later, Hadrian, who would build the city of Arelia Capitolina in Jerusalem, he built a wall across the north of England to keep the Scots from invading Britain. They didn't want to fight with them. It was they were a warrior, tribal warrior, almost uncivilized people that the Romans weren't interested in. So the Romans went no further than York was the last major city heading north in the north of England. They called the Irish Hibernia, and they were also Celts. And the Romans had some bit of trade with them, but did not want to conquer them. They said it was not worth it. They said of the Irish, all of their wars are happy and their songs are sad. Their songs are all sad and their wars are all happy. They basically thought the Irish were crazy. They thought the Picts and Scots were barbarians. The Cornish resisted them. They did not get all of England. All of England was never part of the Roman Empire. In the southwest, it remained Cornish. It remained independent of Rome. The Romans did invade Wales, but were resisted by the Welsh. Even though they reached Anglesey, the Welsh fought off the Romans. So the Celtic world were the ones who stopped the Romans in the north. The Romans knew it wasn't worth trying to fight them. Even if they won, they would have sustained so many casualties, it wouldn't have been worth it. So that's where they stopped, okay? That's where they stopped. They stopped in England, in the north, okay? In the east, again, the people were seen as almost uncivilized and not worth it, and it was seen as too geographically far from Rome to build roads to. The Romans connected their empire with well-built roads. The exception being Romania on the Black Sea. Romania comes from Rome. To this day, Romania is a Latin country. The people are similar to the Italians and the Portuguese. They're not Slavs. They're not a Slavic people. So Rome reached the Black Sea in the east, in Romania. They took Turkey, most of Turkey and Anatolia. That was the Roman province of Asia. But then there were two empires that existed that were not part of the Roman Empire in the east. One of which was Armenia. The Armenian Empire Christianized before the Roman Empire. This idea that, the Roman Catholic Church makes the claim we're the oldest church, which is ridiculous. Similar claims are made by the Eastern Orthodox. The New Testament was not written in Latin. The Vulgate came later. The New Testament was written in Greek. The Eastern Orthodox claimed to be the original church, but the Coptic Church in Egypt is at least as old in the south. However, the first empire that Christianized was not the Roman Empire or the Greco-Roman world. Before they Christianized, the Armenian Empire Christianized. The Armenians were the first empire that was Christian. They were to the east of Turkey, where they are today. They were separated from the Roman Empire by Mount Ararat, where Noah's Ark was. Mount Ararat was right on the border between the Armenian world and the Greco-Roman world. Today, it's on the border between Turkey and Armenia. It's very much akin to Mount Everest being right on the border between Nepal and Tibet, between Nepal and Tibet, which is controlled by China, occupied by China. Well, Mount Ararat with Noah's Ark is the same. The Armenians considered it to be holy because that's where Noah's Ark was. They Christianized before the Roman Empire, but they were independent and seen as benign in the time of Jesus, not at war with the Romans. The threat on the east was Persia, Parthia, Iran. Iran has always been the issue. The conflict would be with Persia, the Iranians, from Aryan, like anthropological cousins of the Germans. Remember, the Iranians, the Persians, Farsi is their language and culture. Their religion was originally Zoroastrian and was influenced by Judaism. But also, despite the fact that they were geographically situated in the Middle East, they were ethnically European. They were ethnically European. So you have a situation then where England became Anglo-Saxon, Germanized, eventually. The original people, we think of England as an Anglo-Saxon country. Anglo-Saxons are Germans. The original people of the British Isles were Celts and the Britons, Gaelic-speaking peoples. But all this interplay happened under the Romans. So too, the same as the Anglo-Saxons were continental Europeans who were resituated in the British Isles, that was not part of continental Europe. The Persians were Europeans who were situated in the Middle East. They were a powerful country, defeated only by Alexander, but a potential threat to Rome. Rome actually was able to defeat them, but not conquer them. To defeat them, but not conquer them. Now, we have to remember something to understand all this background. I tell you for a reason. The return of the Jews from Babylon under Cyrus and then Darius the Mede. Israel was at that time technically a colony or a protected territory of Persia, in the days of King Ahasuerus, the days of Esther and Mordecai. Israel was a colony of the Persians. The Persians, Cyrus the Great, let them go back and let them have autonomy. They had autonomy. They could control their own religion, their own affairs. However, they were very much under the political control of the king of Persia. You see this in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, okay? And it became involved with the whole history of the Samaritans and so forth. Okay. So, the Jews were afraid of another invasion by Iran. They had the prophecies of Daniel. And they were afraid of the Parthians. They were afraid of the Persians. Nobody in the Middle East could stop the Persians. They were good fighters. They were Europeans. The only ones who ever defeated them were the Macedonian Greeks under Alexander, and Rome then defeated them, but not conquered them. If they stopped the invasion and advance. So we're in the intertestamental period with this king, John Hyrcanus. John Hyrcanus does some interesting things in Samaria on Mount Gerizim. He destroys the Samaritan temple, who had a separate mountain. This is the background of John 4. And under the Hasmoneans, the descendants of the Maccabees, the Israelites, the Hebrews, they conquer the eastern shore of the Jordan River and of the Dead Sea, getting strategic control of major areas of Edom, southern Jordan, Moab, central Jordan, and Ammon, northern Jordan. These areas were important to the Hebrews because so much of their history happened there. Moses was buried on Har Nevo, Mount Nebo. Okay. The coming of the Messiah, they saw, would be somehow associated in the scriptures with Mount Seir. Mount Seir. Of course, Petra was there, then called Basra. And it's where the 12 tribes came across. Okay? So they controlled this area. They had a big chunk of real estate. And they didn't want to lose it. They were afraid of the Persians, of the Parthians. Meanwhile, John Hyrcanus, the high priest who wrongly made himself a king, had a deputy, a right-hand man. He was an Arab called Antipater. Antipater was from Jordan, this area where the Hasmoneans conquered it. Antipater, like the other people, were known as Idumeans from Edom. A large section of them who converted to Judaism migrated and were brought to the western side of the Dead Sea and settled in the northern Negev. This Antipater, who was the deputy to Hyrcanus, was a political animal and an opportunist. He was an ethnic Arab. He was an Arab who converted to Judaism under the Hasmoneans. It was at this time the high priesthood and Levitical priesthood began to go off significantly and become more and more political. Something happens. He eventually gets leadership control from Hyrcanus. The way he gets it is he makes a deal with Rome. He wanted Rome to protect them, protect Israel, protect the Hasmonean Empire from the Persians. That is the Parthians. He makes a deal with the Roman general Pompey Magnus, Pompey the Great, from the famous triumvirate. Pompey promises Roman protection of Israel from the Persians. Save us from the Iranians. Rome says, okay, sign on the dotted line. They make a covenant with Rome in the face of the threat from Iran. It is important to understand this history in order to understand the coming Antichrist. Daniel 10, the threat of the Prince of Persia. And then you see the Prince of Greece. The Romans would have spoken Latin for legal purposes, but colloquially, they would have spoken Koine Greek. They copied their culture from the Greeks. Remember, Rome conquered Greece strategically. Greece conquered Rome intellectually and culturally. The cultural war between Rome and Greece was won by Greece. The strategic war was run by Rome. Italy had been run by Etruscans and other people like this who were interesting in their own right, but didn't come anything close to Greece. Greece meant European civilization. Caesar Augustus tried to make Rome the new Athens architecturally. And they began adopting all the accoutrements of Greek religion and so forth and bringing it to Rome. Even the gladiators came from the Peloponnese, from Greece at first. So now you've got the European world, the Greco-Roman world. It goes from the north of England to the Sahara and to Mauritania. It goes from the Pillars of Hercules, from the Rock of Gibraltar and Ceuta, from the Atlantic Ocean, and it goes all the way into Jordan. No problem with the Armenians. They were benign. They didn't get along with the Celts, but they got tired of fighting them eventually. They fought them, and that was going on in the first century, but by the time Hadrian came, that was it. They built the wall. They didn't want to mess with them anymore. Okay. But there's still Iran, Persia. That is a big picture of what happens at the close of the age. The way the Jews made a deal with the Romans is in the face of the Persian, that is Iranian threat. That will happen again, you understand? In the face of a threat from Iran, they will look to the West. Now, they make a covenant with death. They get more than they bargained for. When they made this treaty with the Romans to protect them from, as it were, Iran, Persia, Parthia, they found out that they were not a protectorate. They found out that they were a colony. They didn't read the fine print. The paramount of this realization was after they make the deal with the Romans, after Antipater makes the deal with the Romans, Pompey, the general from the triumvirate, enters the Holy of Holies in the rebuilt temple. He's a major type of the Antichrist, like Antiochus. When somebody other than Jesus or the high priest on the Day of Atonement enters the Holy of Holies, It is a type of the Antichrist who'll go into the Holy of Holies, set up the abomination of desolations. You understand? What happened then is a picture of what is going to happen in the future. This is the historical background of the relationship between the high priesthood, the Sanhedrin, the Sadducees, and the Romans. Now, in reaction, there were Jews who felt they were betrayed by the Romans. We never should have made that deal with Pompey. These become the Pharisees, the Prushim. They see themselves in the character of the Maccabees. The Maccabees resisted Antiochus when he defiled the Holy of Holies. Antiochus IV. Epiphanes. Okay. And they view the Sadducees as being like Menelaus, the high priest who collaborated with Antiochus. You understand? They saw it as a replay of the Maccabees, of the story of Hanukkah. We talked about this a bit when we were in chapter 10, when Jesus celebrated Hanukkah, the Feast of Dedication, in John chapter 10. Okay? Antipas, an ethnic Arab, an Idumean, is born into Israel. The Arab presence in Israel was never indigenous. They were bought there. However, Antipas has a son who is completely Roman in his civil and political identity and in his cultural identity, in his political loyalties to Caesar. Okay? He is Herod the Great, the emperor when Jesus was born, and the time of Tiberius. The Herodians, particularly Herod the Great, but then his sons to a lesser degree, was considered so Roman by the Romans that there was no proconsul or procurator. There was no Roman governor. It was only after he died that Pilate was appointed. You understand? The Roman capital then in Israel, the district capital of Israel, and they did not call it Israel, was Caesarea Maritima, Caesarea on the coast. It was not Jerusalem. Jerusalem, there was a praetorium, there was a palace. Okay? There was a palace, but it was not the primary one. It was next to the Roman garrison in the fortress on the north side of the Temple Mount that was called Fortress Antonio, named after Mark Antony. This kind of thing. Okay? Well, you've got an Arab ethnically, a Jew by religion, and a Roman by citizenship and culture. As I've explained before, Herod the Great is a major, major picture of the Antichrist. A major picture of the Antichrist. He is somebody who the Europeans regard as a European. The Europeans regard him as a European. The Jews regard him as a Jew, and the Arabs, of course, regard him as an Arab. Now, we'll be dealing with him a lot more, Lord willing, in the book that I'm planning to write, Born in a Manger, Coming on a Cloud. But we also deal with him a lot in the book, Shadows of the Beast, how he's a picture of the Antichrist. How he's able to bring this kind of a unity, a pan-nationalism between the Jews, the Europeans, that is the Romans, and the Arabs. Okay. When he dies, the prophecy of Genesis 49 to the tribe of Judah is essentially fulfilled. The scepter will not depart from Judah, Jacob prophesies in Genesis 49, until Shiloh comes, until the Messiah comes. Shiloh coming from the word shaliach, the one who was sent. Messiah is the one who was sent. The word apostle comes from the same term, the ones who are sent. The pool of Siloam, same root in Hebrew, Shiloach, the one who was sent. The rabbis understood this to mean the Messiah. The scepter would not depart from Judah. Jesus comes. Herod the Great dies. And the land is partitioned. Galilee goes into the hands of another Herod, the Herod that Jesus will appear before, who also has a palace fortress in Jerusalem. But the area around Jerusalem, or the area from the northern, from Idumea, that is in the northern Negev, where the converted Arabs were, around Jerusalem, all the way to the Jordan, and then north of there until Samaria, is called Judea. Judea. The scepter departs from Judah. What happens? The government is no longer based in Jerusalem or in Judah, where the house of David was from, Bethlehem and Jerusalem. It is moved to Caesarea, which is on the coast of Samaria, or it was then, on the coast of Samaria near Strato's Tower. It is there where so much of the history of the early church commenced. It's where Paul's trial before Festus was. It's where he was in prison for 2 years. It is where the first non-Jews became Christians. If we look upon the Samaritans as semi-Jews and the Ethiopian eunuch proselytes, but the first totally ethnic non-Jews were Cornelius and his family, and they were in Caesarea, where the Roman garrison and capital was. Peter has to go from Jaffa to Caesarea. Caesarea is the main city. It is the fourth biggest city of the Roman Empire. It is a big deal place. Jerusalem was much smaller. It was the former capital. It's sort of like Bonn, Germany. Bonn was the temporary capital of West Germany until Germany reunited when the Iron Curtain collapsed and the Berlin Wall came down. Now Bonn is a little city-like. It's nothing. There's still some government offices there, but Berlin is the capital of the Reich and everything, where the Reichsland was. Same kind of thing. However, Jerusalem did remain a strategic place of importance and religious importance because of the pilgrim feasts of the Jews. Passover, obviously, Feast of Tabernacles, obviously, and the Feast of Weeks, Hag Shavuot, obviously. Pesach, Passover, Pentecost, and John 7, the Feast of Tabernacles. The population would swell. Jews would come from Galilee. They'd come from other countries. They'd come from Parthia on a pilgrimage 3 times a year. The population of Jerusalem could reach about 120,000. The way you might think of it would be like Brighton or Blackpool in England, or like maybe Atlantic City in the United States. In the summertime, people will come to Atlantic City in New Jersey, from Philadelphia and New York, and its population will get bigger temporarily during the summer holiday season. Or the same in England with Brighton and places like that. They're not that big, but people come there during the holiday season and the population swells. It was very much a seasonal place with a big tourist industry, only instead of tourists, they were religious pilgrims. The Roman garrison was there. Herod had a palace there, which now its foundation still exists underneath the citadel of David near Jaffa Gate in the old city of Jerusalem. The fortress Antonio and a Roman praetorium next to it was just north of the Temple Mount. Pilate could come there. Herod's son could come there. But the scepter departed from Judah. Whoever the Messiah was, he had to come already, because the seat of government was no longer Judah. Now they're there. And during the pilgrimage times, like Passover, things became very sensitive and intense politically. There was an author who wrote a brilliant book about a Jew who seems to become a Christian about this time, and it became a famous movie called Ben-Hur. Ben-Hur. That book and the film was a good adaptation. Most films, the book is usually better, but that is a case where the film was quite good. Accurate to the book, and the book was accurate to the history as a docufiction. It was a very intense time between the Romans and the Jews. The Sadducees wanted to get along with them. The Herodians were Romans, not ethnically, but culturally and politically. The Essenes are out in the wilderness. The Pharisees didn't like them. The Pharisees are looking at themselves as the descendants of the Maccabees, trying to point the people back to God and looking upon the Romans the way the Maccabees looked upon Antiochus and the Seleucid Greeks, and looking upon the Sadducees the way the Maccabees looked upon Menelaus and the Jews who collaborated with the Seleucids and with Antiochus, as prophesied by Daniel. Again, Jesus observes this. So that's the situation now. The Pharisees were very keen to have a Messiah who would come. They thought he might come at Hanukkah or at Passover. And he would depose the Romans the way the Maccabees deposed the Greeks, who defiled the Holy of Holies similarly, and who would slaughter the Jewish traitors, the collaborators, whom they saw as the Herodians and the Sadducees. So the Pharisees had that orientation. They wanted a Messiah in the character of the Maccabees, a conquering military conqueror. The Sadducees were the collaborators. This is how people thought. The more radical of the anti-Romans, as we looked at last week, were the ones Josephus called the Sikkim, the Zealots. They would be political assassins and things like this, but they would perpetrate crimes against their own people. To make a modern comparison again, you could draw a contrast between them and the Provisional IRA or the UVF and UDA in Belfast in Northern Ireland during the so-called Troubles. Same way. They oppressed their own people while professing to be liberators, and they carried it out in the name of religion of sorts. So the Messianic expectation was somebody's going to get rid of the Romans. This is what happens at Palm Sunday. They think Jesus is going to get rid of the Romans. When he doesn't, now he's vulnerable. The people who cheered him and supported him are not looking upon him as a messianic figure anymore. Only his disciples who knew him and some of the other people still followed him. But they were looking for this national liberation. This was not his purpose in his first coming. It is his purpose in his second coming. Again, this is explained to us in the book of Acts, chapter 1, at the Ascension. Turn with me, please, to Acts chapter 1. Verse 6. So when they had come together, they were asking him, saying, Lord, is it at this time you're restoring the kingdom to Israel? Well, we know you're the Messiah, and we know you died for our sin and rose from the dead to give eternal life. But is it at this time you're going to restore the throne of David that was lost with the Babylonian captivity? Is it at this time you're going to get rid of the Romans, the way the Maccabees got rid of the Greeks, and set up the Messianic kingdom, in other words, the millennium? That was their thinking. The apostles didn't quite get it yet. John the Baptist certainly didn't get it. Even the most enlightened of the people didn't fully understand. That is, those who knew Jesus. They came to understand. However, once he did not do what they thought he was going to do with the triumphal entry, now they were more easily manipulated against it, to turn against him. You understand? He disappointed us. He's not the Messiah. The Romans are still there. The Sanhedrin, wanting to protect their own position of privilege and power, they were a theocratic aristocracy, knew all of the political and social conditions that were prevailing. We see this in the text of John 19. Look at it again. We see where he says, they say, he said he was the Son of God. Okay. In verse 7, we have a Torah, and by that Torah, that law, he ought to die because he made himself to be the Son of God. When Pilate therefore heard this statement, he became afraid. Why? Because the Romans, beginning with Caesar Augustus, believed Caesar Huios Theon, Caesar, Son of God. Caesar was the Son of God. They, of course, identified God with the planet Jupiter. He was the biggest god, Jupiter, the biggest planet. That was simply a Roman adaptation of Zeus, a corruption of Theos, Zeus, Theos. Now, Zeus, in Greek mythology, but they believed it, was a god who was on Mount Olympus. And he impregnated a human woman and brought about a savior of the poor people whose name was Hercules. And so you have this parallelism where Jesus is the Son of God and he's going to be the hero of the Am Haaretz, the poor. They begin interpreting it in that light. You understand? Of course, Zeus was not God. Of course, he did not impregnate a human woman. And although Hercules, by myth, was a man of superhuman strength and quality, he was half human and half divine. Jesus was God incarnated inside of Mary, Miriam, and he was not half human and half divine. He was fully human and fully divine. He wasn't 50-50, he was 100 and 100. But you have to understand the Romans were influenced by the Greeks in their thinking about religion. Jupiter. Who's the Son of God? Who's the hero? Who's the liberator? It's Caesar! Beginning with Caesar Augustus. So, when Pilate begins to hear this guy saying he's the Son of God, wait a minute, Caesar's the Son of God. Now it begins to suggest political sedition against Rome. You understand? The Sadducees knew how to play that card. They knew how to manipulate the people. That Jesus did not depose the Romans on Palm Sunday a week or several days earlier. And they knew how to play the Romans. They understood the anxiety and apprehensions of Pilate, and they understood the messianic expectations of the people. They knew how to manipulate politically. They knew how to play the people the way they wanted. They knew how to manipulate Pilate. I hope I'm making sense. It's important to understand the history, to understand the Sitzum Leben of the text. You cannot understand the Passion narratives unless you understand the milieu it comes out of. It is not simply history. It is prophecy. It begins in the book of Daniel. And it is not only played out in his first coming at the crucifixion, it foreshadows what's going to happen at his second coming. You understand? So we're looking at what did happen, but we are getting an outline of things that are going to happen. We're looking at multiple time frames. The Maccabees and the Hasmonean period that followed it. Then we're looking at the Second Temple period at the time of Jesus. But then we're looking at what's going to happen when he returns. It's going to follow a pattern of sorts. He will fulfill those prophecies and expectations that the people, the ordinary people, the Am Ha'aretz had. Jesus will do that when he returns in Zechariah 12 and Revelation 19 and so forth. But that was not his purpose in his first coming, but his second. So that is the background of this text. I hope I didn't bore you with all the history. But to really understand what's happening, you have to understand the history. And what prophecies were fulfilled, what it foreshadows for the future, why Pilate behaved the way he did, what the Sadducees and the high priests were doing, and why. It was a political chess game, and it was a mind game. Let's go back to verse 1. The prophecies of Isaiah 52 and 53, the fourth servant song of Isaiah, begin to become fulfilled. They scourged him. Now, this scourging was not a conventional flogging. The Romans had something called flagellum. They had a multi-corded whip that had bone tissue and strips of metal attached to the leather thongs. It was not designed to beat somebody. The Torah had flogging, but there was a limitation as to how many times you could hit somebody, and it was with a rod. It was not with one of these Roman devices that was in effect a weapon. A weapon. Because of the metal strips and the bone tissue, it was designed to rip the soft tissue off the hard tissue. In other words, not just the skin, but the underlying subcutaneous tissue down to the muscle tissue. You are not simply going to sever capillaries, you might even hit blood vessels. You understand? You could kill somebody by doing it. It was not a per se flogging. It was something that would not simply scar someone for life, but leave them with ripped open wounds, damaging muscle tissue, sometimes down to the bone tissue, to the hard tissue. It could separate the hard tissue from the soft tissue. It's something barbaric. It was not a whip or something like that. It was a weapon. They wove the crown of thorns. Now, I've seen these kinds of thorns, and we pretty well know what kind of thorn bushes that the Romans would have used. This was not like a rose between two thorns. It was not those kinds of thorns. These are big spike-like thorns that are sharp, pointy, and long. They will cut into the skin, into the scalp. and induce cranial bleeding. They were going to dress him up like a king. Here is your king. So they crown him with thorns. Now you have to understand the procedures of the crucifixion correspond to the propensity of the flesh of fallen man. We have poisoned minds because of sin. The scripture speaks of the lust of the eye. The blood would have came down from the cranium when he's holding the cross into his eyes. He would have been blinded and not being able to see much. The blood would keep getting into his eyes. We sin. Proverbs says, the feet that run to sin. Hence, he was nailed to the cross. He could not run. Crucified. The hands would not have been the hands. Forget this Roman Catholic stigmata nonsense. We know from medical experiments done on cadavers and from certain archaeological evidence that you cannot crucify somebody through the metacarpal. It would have been through the radius. Okay. The Hebrew word for hand and arm, however, is the same. Yad, yadayim. The marks would have been here. Extremely painful. Severing the radial nerves. So you can't do sin. You can't see lust of the eye, lust of the flesh. You can't run to sin. The boastful pride of life. The flesh has been flayed, not just beaten, it's been flayed open. They, of course, rip his clothes off. Then they dress him up again like a king. The nakedness has to be understood. We have two words for nakedness in Hebrew. One is simply erva. It means uncovered. That could be a naked flame or in the naked light. Not a naked person, a naked anything. It means uncovered. It is not necessarily sexually connotated even. Okay. It can be. The term is used repeatedly in Leviticus chapter 20 for uncovering nakedness. In the Torah prohibitions against incestuous relationships, having sex with relatives and things like this. If you read Leviticus 20, this uncovering of the nakedness, it is idiomatic. Let me explain idiomatic. Well, I know you know what it means in English, an idiom. If I was to say something like, oh, she has a green thumb, or that's a red herring. You could get it now. We say a green thumb from the culture, from the cultural context. We know that somebody with the green thumb is somebody with the talent for gardening and horticulture. But no dictionary is going to tell you that. You can read about the color green on the spectrum, and you can read about a thumb, the ulna. But it's only the culture will tell you what having a green thumb means. Okay? That's a red herring. A red herring is a diversion from the main point. No dictionary is going to tell you what red herring means. It'll tell you what the color red is on the spectrum, and it will tell you that herring is a fish. And if you burn the fish on certain kinds of coal, the fish will turn red. It's a red herring. Well, it'll tell you red and herring or green and thumb, but it's not going to tell you what they mean idiomatically. You understand? We understand. Uncovering nakedness means the same thing. It means to anatomically uncover someone's reproductive organs for purposes of sexual copulation. Where it says in Leviticus, you shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife, for that is your father's nakedness. Okay. They are one flesh. It's okay. But if you do something of a sexual nature with your father, uncovering his nakedness. This is what Paul is getting at in 1 Corinthians 5. You understand? But that guy in the church who was a perv with his father's wife. Okay. You shall not uncover your sister's nakedness and things like this. The prohibitions in Torah against incestuous sexual relationships. In a sexual context, the person you are sexually engaged with, you become one flesh with them. Their nakedness is your nakedness. You understand? But you don't uncover the nakedness of another simply means you do not sexually copulate with anybody unless they're your spouse. There is that aspect. This explains the curse on Ham in the book of Genesis. Remember the curse on Canaan, rather, when Ham did what he did. It's showing sexual perversion and something incestuous, which God says is perverse. Okay, there's that. The other word in Hebrew is arum. Arum. That occurs in Genesis when Adam and Eve sinned. They needed the garments of salvation. I've explained this recently in a different Bible study. Arum comes from the nature of the serpent who beguiled the woman. It says the serpent was more crafty. Now that word crafty can be understood from the epidermis of a snake as a reptile that sheds its skin. What is it? Crafty. It's slippery. Slippery. Even in English, we talk about people who are less than honest in their dealings as being slippery. The term crafty, illustrated by the slippery nature of the skin of the snake who beguiled the woman, is where you get the word Adam and Eve were arumim, were naked. They did not have the garments of salvation. You understand? They tried to cover their nakedness with fig leaves, which represents works. Most of you know this. The leaves are for the healing of the nations. No, without the shedding of blood, there can be no forgiveness of sin. There had to be a blood sacrifice, the garments of salvation. When Jesus took our sin, the last Adam, the first Adam, and then Jesus is the last one. He had to undo the failure and the sin of the first Adam, which is transmitted into us by birth. So by second birth, we have the nature of Jesus transmitted into us. By birth, we are sons of Adam. By second birth, we are sons of God. Children of God, if you will. Hence, Adam sinned and was naked, and Eve. But they didn't know it. Not any more than a baby crawling around on a carpet naked knows that doesn't mean anything. There is an innocence to the condition. Adam and Eve were created without imperfection. They had no imperfection, but they were not yet perfected. Okay? They were not yet perfected. Think of a healthy newborn baby. The healthy newborn baby has no imperfections. The baby is born, a neonatologist or a pediatrician examines it, checks it for certain things, checks the eyes particularly. Healthy baby, they weigh it and so on. There's nothing wrong with it. It is a healthy baby, thank God. Okay. It has no imperfections, but it is not yet perfected. We were like that. We had no imperfections, that is Adam and Eve, but they were not yet perfected. To be perfected, they had to eat of the tree of life. Instead, they ate from the tree of the world, knowledge of good and evil, under the seduction of the crafty one. You understand? Then people became slippery. People tend to be con artists by nature. Now, this is understood in light of John's Gospel, which we're studying in John 1 with Nathanael. Remember, among the Jews, the tree of life is represented by a fig tree. Nathanael, who was from Cana, asked Jesus, "How did you know? I saw you under the fig tree." Jesus is, of course, pointing back to the garden. You understand? To Adam and Eve, Adam v'Hava. And he says of Nathanael, "Behold a man in Israel in whom there is no guile." Another way in English we translate crafty, arum, where we get naked, is that the serpent beguiled the woman. Paul picks this up in Romans. In 2 Corinthians. I fear, my brethren, that as the devil beguiled Eve, Satan's going to beguile you, meaning a church. He's slippery, seductive. Nathanael represents somebody free of the guile. You understand? Because Jesus saw him under the tree of life. when you eat of the tree of life, we become perfected. You eat the fruit of the Spirit. We take on the nature of Jesus. Now, this is a deep subject in itself, and it has more to do with Genesis. I'm only dealing with it in relation to John and to the crucifixion. Jesus has to find himself in the same condition as Adam and as fallen man. You understand? Adam. Now, it's a little bit complicated because in Greek you have one basic word for naked. If you don't know what it is, you'll find it amusing, perhaps. Gymnos, where you get gymnasium. Because in the Greek Olympics, the athletes would compete naked. This became a big issue in the Maccabean revolt. Okay? This became an offense to the Jews in the Maccabean revolt. Well, let's look. So, what they do is they put this purple robe on him. Purple in the Roman culture was a royal color. It indicated royalty. In Revelation 1, we see Jesus wearing a combination of royal and priestly garments for a reason. He's got a crown and he's got a robe mimicking a royal robe. And they began to come to him saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" and smacking him in the face, punching him, and so on, abusing him and mocking him. Now, we have a teaching, an older Moriel teaching you may find interesting, called the judgment of Satan. The way that Jesus, who was the King of the Jews and the King of Kings, and God, was humiliated and ridiculed, the book of Isaiah tells us that is going to happen to Satan. Is this the man who shook the earth? Satan will be mocked and ridiculed in eternity, for all eternity. To understand the judgment of Satan, one of the things we must understand is the judgment for our sin poured out on Christ. Satan will literally be mocked and ridiculed. You were the king of the world. You were the ruler of this world. You were the God of the world. It's going to be ridiculed. We can read Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 26. I'd point you to the recorded teaching, the judgment of Satan. Satan does not like that particular teaching. He always seems to get upset whenever somebody listens to it. So make sure you pray before you push the button, because he doesn't want you to listen to it. That's his problem. So they dress him up like a king. And Pilate came out again and said to them, "Behold, I'm bringing him out to you. You may know I find no guilt in him. Look, we flogged the guy Roman style. He's got serious bleeding, serious tissue damage. In modern terms, he would have required suturing at the very least. Possibly vascular surgery. Isn't this enough? Jesus therefore came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said, "Ecce homo, behold the man." When therefore the chief priests, these are Sadducees, and the officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify, crucify." Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him. I find no guilt in him." Knowing that the Sanhedrin could not readily execute somebody by Roman law. We've already talked about this. He's trying to save Jesus' neck, in some sense. Verse 7, we have a law. By this law, he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God. And Pilate gets troubled by this statement. No, that is supposed to be Caesar is the Son of God. Now they're manipulating him. Well, let's continue. When Pilate therefore heard this statement, he was more afraid. Oh boy, if Rome finds out. And he entered into the praetorium again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus would not answer. Again, Isaiah 53, like a lamb that is silent before its shearers. Pilate therefore said to him, "Do you not speak to me? You not know I have the authority to release you and I have the authority to crucify you." And the Romans crucified thousands of Jews. Herod killed many Jews. Jesus answered, "You'd have no authority over me unless it's been given to you from above." Nobody. Daniel chapter 2, verse 18. Nobody has any civil authority that God has not allowed it. Nobody. Nobody. They may be bad, but they couldn't be there if God didn't allow it. Again, the two people who made the rebirth of national Israel possible. Without them, there would be no nation of Israel in fulfillment of prophecy. I speak of Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler. The two biggest murderers now would be a third of the 20th century. The two biggest murderers in the Western world of the 20th century. Genocidal madmen, demon-possessed, criminally insane, genocidal murderers. But without the Holocaust, the United Nations never would have made Israel a nation. Without Stalin, there wouldn't have been a second Aliyah. The Jews would not have fled from Stalin and come to Israel and began all these kibbutzes and moshavs, draining the swamps, irrigating the desert. It happened. Were they evil men? They're very evil men. Demon-possessed, obviously. Did God allow them? Yeah, they have no authority except that which God allows. The ultimate example of this will be the Antichrist. Zechariah 11. He is an agent of God. God allows him. Not our subject tonight, but one we have spoken about recently. Now let's look at this. As a result of this, in verse 12, Pilate made efforts to release him. He's trying to get him off the hook. But the Jews, that is the religious establishment and the people they controlled in Judea, cried out, If you release this man, you're no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes Caesar. They knew how to politically manipulate Pilate. It was not about justice. It was about political corruption. Whenever you see a judiciary being used as a vehicle of political and politically motivated persecution, it's not about justice. It's about injustice. Even today, a guy whose salvation I pray for, Alan Dershowitz, invented the term lawfare. Lawfare. And of course, he was one of the attorneys, despite being a liberal Democrat, who defended Donald Trump. But this is not new. Politicized courts. We saw this throughout the history of the church, in the Inquisitions, in the Counter-Reformation, the persecution of believers. And it will happen under the domain of Antichrist. The way you see these things now, I was watching news clips in recent days following the American election. And a number of people who were very angry about the election results kept saying things like white, male, patriarchy, and Christian. I didn't know your skin color was something that indicted you. I didn't know your biological gender is something that indicted you. I didn't know being a Christian indicts you. But you see these people saying this stuff, don't you? It's going to get worse. Being a Christian will be seen as political sedition. And they will racialize everything. Remember, nation will rise against nation, ethnon against ethnon. And I don't just mean black and white. I mean yellow against yellow, black against black, white against white. It doesn't matter. When you see this happening, when you see the judiciary being misused by a corrupt political or religious establishment, our Torah says he ought to die. He makes himself out to be, says he's the Son of God. What if he is the Son of God? They'll plead religion, ethics, righteousness, justice. It goes on. When Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the pavement, Gabbatha, in Hebrew. Can you imagine? God becomes a man and stands before the seat of judgment, charged with sedition, and blasphemy. Jesus was not guilty of sedition, and Pilate knew it. Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world." The Father would send angels, legions of them. My kingdom is not of this world. He was not guilty of the sedition. And he was accused of blasphemy, of auto-deification, deifying himself. Have you ever seen videos of Stephen Furtick? Remember, when we make our own moral standards, instead of recognizing the standards God has given, rough example. God condemns incestuous relationships. There are cultures where it is practiced. It was practiced in Appalachian America even. It was practiced by the royal families of Europe. They saw marriages between dynasties and nations as ways of making political alliances and preventing wars. It never worked. Whenever man sets himself up to make his own moral standards, it goes back to the garden. You understand? You shall be like God. You'll make your own standards of right and wrong. Now they're doing it with same-sex marriage and transgenderism. Forget about he made them male and female. They set up their own standards. This is self-deification. You are overriding, superseding the word of God. You're making yourself like God. If an angel of God comes with another gospel, don't believe it. I believe I'm saved, not just through the blood of Jesus, but through sacraments and rituals, and by atoning for my own sin in purgatory. But wait a minute, that's not the gospel. It's what I want to believe. When you see a person with another gospel, they are deifying themselves. The Pope of Rome has deified himself. This present Pope said, you can, his priests, bless same-sex relationships, quote unquote, and transgender people can be baptized, by which he means sprinkled. That's what Pope Francis said. Is that an antichrist or what? Of course it is. You see this in Mormonism with Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. You see it in the Jehovah's Witness cult. Charles Taze Russell and Rutherford, Nathan Knorr and these guys. It's always the same, but it always goes back to Genesis. They were beguiled by the devil into thinking they can be their own God. Now, Jesus was God, but came in the form of a servant to save us. He was a king, but he did not engage in sedition. Even when Satan said, I show you the kingdoms of the world in Matthew 4, Jesus never questioned that Satan was the God of this world. His day is going to come when he's not, but Jesus never questioned that. God gave dominion to man, and man foolishly gave it to Satan. Well, when we sin, we do the same thing. Instead of having the power over our own lives, we give place to the enemy. So, he's executed for sedition, of which he was not guilty, and blasphemy, deifying himself, for which he was not guilty. However, you and I were guilty of those things. We are rebels. We have engaged in rebellion against God. And a kind of self-deification, putting our law above his. We're guilty of what he was falsely accused of. But he took the blame in Gethsemane in the garden. And now the anger of God due us is put on his innocent son. Verse 14. Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover, and it was about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, behold your king. And they therefore cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said, shall I crucify your king? And the chief priests said, we have no king but Caesar. That same kind of thing is going to happen with the Antichrist and false prophet. They'll reject the real Jesus. They will seek to crucify his body. And they will say to the Antichrist, we have no king but him. This is not just past history. It's future prophecy. It's an ongoing reality. It is a dynamic. The same kind of political manipulations and the corruptions of the judiciary you saw with Jesus is going to happen at the close of the age. You understand? When they come after the true church and after true believers. We need to understand these things.